Senator Colcourt, you're recognized as committee substitute for Senate Bill 421 to suspend the regular order of business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I make this motion, Mr. President, I would like to say a few things about Senate Bill 421.
Members, I'd like to have order on the floor so it can be heard clearly.
Thank you, Mr. President. You always know you're carrying a pretty big bill when your folder ends up this size. And there's actually more papers down there. And you know you're carrying a big bill when you go to State Affairs and you lay out a bill and you didn't invite one person to come testify, not one. And then you have 50 to 60 people that organically show up and tell you about something so very precious, something that our Constitution guarantees us, the ability to own our own land, the ability to own our own land. And then they tell the story of how that land can be taken from them. And not by elected officials that are our counties sometimes, or TxDOT that need to take your land because they're going to build a highway for the greater good of our state and for our country, but by people that have eminent domain power because we as a body have given it to them. We have given it to them. And for some of those companies, all they have to do is go before the Railroad Commission, fill out a form and check a box, and they have that power. But they told the stories of how difficult it was when that land negotiation happened, because they didn't have a sign of for sale on that land. They didn't want a pipeline or a power line to come through their land, and yet they were forced to do so. One, Senator Huffman, one person testified and handed out his contract that he was offered $10. That was his initial offer, $10. Senator Menendez, you fight every day here for the little people. So I started with this big idea in 2015 that said, I'm going to fix this. We're going to get a good initial offer up front, and then all these negotiations will go away. And this floor, some of you were here, voted for Senate Bill 474. And it would have resulted in good initial upfront offers. It actually was a bonus if you beat them at district court or at the special commissioner's court. You got your legal fees paid for. Well, that bill died in the House. Last session, I came to the floor with a bill that neither side liked, but you voted for it again. And today I come to you with a bill that when it started in Joan Huffman's State Affairs Committee was a really tough bill. It was a really tough bill. So if you go back and you look at the witness list, there are 50 or 60 people that came here and testified for it. And if you go looking at the people that testified or dropped cards against it, most of those people you will find on an ethics report because they're paid to be here to do those kind of things. But today, I'm going to bring a skinnier bill to this floor, much less than what was passed out 8-0 out of State Affairs, much less, but trying to give some certainty to landowners that don't want to sell their land, but are going to sell their land, and forever, this is the part that's the hardest, forever give the rights for someone to come on that land to repair the pipeline. Imagine this, Senator Nelson, fishing or hunting with your grandchild. For me, my days are limited. I hardly get to do that because we choose public service, right? But to be in a deer stand and to have someone come on your land and to interrupt that one special Saturday morning or that one special Friday morning, that might have been the only day that you could hunt with your child. Because in the terms, it wasn't spelled out. Because forever, when you let someone have an easement through your property, you have given them the right to come on and repair whatever is in that easement. And so I had this grandiose idea this session. I was going to come here and I was going to convince everyone that, man, when you're in a forced sale, you should be paid a bonus up front. Your initial offer should just be a bonus up front. And actually, State Affairs agreed with me. And they voted it out 8-0. Well, let me tell you, y'all know when you carry a big bill, it's not just the size of the folder, but it's the people that beat a path to our office. Well, I listened. I knew that was too tough a bill. Yeah, I'd get a 45% bonus off an appraised value to sell your land when you didn't want to sell it. Sounds pretty good to most of us. And if we took it to our constituents, they would all say, show me voting aye. But I started a process, and I want to thank Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick for involving himself in this process of meeting with both the landowners, represented by the Farm Bureau, Texas Wildlife Association, and the cattle raisers, Texas and Southwestern cattle raisers, on one side of the table. And on the other side of the table, the Pipeline Association, Texoga, and AECT. For 3 weeks we have met. Rarely is it that a bill is voted out of a committee unanimously. You hold on for 3 weeks. Why? Because I wanted to come to this floor today and say to each and every one of you, it's an agreed to bill. We agree that taking land from someone in a forced sale is really a high order that we give, a high bar that someone should have to clear. But today I come to you with a very skinny bill, and there's still arguments against it. Last night at 7 o'clock, 7:30, I missed the former senator's reception because I was in the Ramsey room still trying to work out those details. Still trying to make it. And let me tell you what I witnessed. I witnessed at times during these 3 weeks, the landowners almost get up and walk out because they thought I'd given too much. And on the flip side, what I witnessed last night when I said, I'll give you this, this, and this, because we were down to 4 issues. We were down to 4 issues. And when I said I'll give on all 4 issues, the answer was, well, there's another 40 that we would like to talk about. The Lieutenant Governor rightfully stood up and said, we're done. We're done. How much more can the landowners give? They're already giving their land. Senate Bill 421, all it does is does this. All of you are very worried about this. We took the penalties out at the end. There's no penalties. There's no penalties there. If you have your lawyer, you're going to have to pay for it. Good luck. On the front end, there's no bonus. All the front end says is that in the initial offer, you have to give an appraisal, which they probably won't do because that costs a little bit of money, a comparative market analysis, or a market study, or a broker's price opinion. The middle part of the bill says, hey, to give up your land in a forced sale, these are the minimum easement standards. Can you believe that you don't even know what the meets and bounds are? Or as one farmer said to me, I was disking and I hit a pipeline. I didn't know it was so shallow. The minimum easement standards just say how deep it is, what's going through that pipeline. Hey, how many are you going to put on my property? You got to lock the gate. Those little things, and that's a true story. Cheryl Tiemann, my district director, if you've ever called the Brenham office, you've heard her voice. She's a widow now. Her husband died last June of cancer. He was diagnosed and dead in 6 months. She runs cattle. Guess what? She's got a pipeline that came through. She negotiated her terms by herself. She didn't even hire a lawyer because she couldn't afford to. She didn't want to give up that revenue. Literally 2 weeks ago, had to leave our district office because someone in the pipeline company had left her gate open and all of her cows were out on a county road. Now, we might not think that's anything, but guess what? There was about $50,000 to Cheryl Tiemann on that county road because someone didn't have the decency to lock her gate. So a widow, Cheryl Tiemann, who had had foot surgery in a boot, is out on a county road in Washington County trying to get $50,000 back into her pasture. Is that asking too much? All of us love oil and gas. I've talked to Democrats and Republicans today, urban and rural, and we're all concerned about oil and gas. But is minimum easements and putting that in there too much to say? No. And they actually halfway agree with that. But then we get to the final part of the bill, and this is where it kind of comes off the rails. Let me tell you about power lines. Gosh, none of us want them on our property, but they're pretty good actors. You know why? They have to go before the PUC. They have to have a public meeting where anyone can come in and say, I don't want that power line here. I want it to go a different route. I want monopoles. I don't want lattice work. And that's why this bill was, in many ways, showed great deference to the power lines. But in a pipeline, you don't know anything. The county judge doesn't even know there's a pipeline coming through there. We put that in this bill. Don't you think your county judge should just get a phone call instead of him or her just receiving all these phone calls and complaints? That's a simple thing. But here's the other part of the meeting part of this bill. The meeting part of this bill is not even for pipelines going to be public. We have whittled it, Senator Huffman, you and your members, when you voted it out, it was a public meeting. We have literally whittled it down to the fact of this. We're going to have a meeting. You only have to have a meeting every 100 miles along that pipeline. If I left this floor today and drove to Brenham, that's 88 miles. You're actually past to Chapel Hill. From here to Chapel Hill, they only have to have one meeting. It has to be within about 50 miles. And guess what? It's not public anymore. No media can come into that meeting. Not a media person. We restrict who comes in. It's your landowner. You can bring a relative. Isn't that nice? Within third degree of consanguinity. And you can bring your lawyer. And guess what? You got to be ID'd to come into that meeting. No public official, you as a state senator, you're not allowed in that meeting unless it's on your land. That is what we have gotten to. That is where we are in this bill. And I don't mean to be preaching to y'all, but we have worked so hard to get to this moment, to give some certainty to people that have to give up their land to a private entity, on a forced sale. I want to say something about, there were some rough times in those meetings. There were times when the cattle raisers representative, he was going to walk out. He'd slam his book closed because he wasn't happy about what I was offering up. But I want to tell you, when amendments started showing up today, guess who came? The landowners. And almost in a pitiful manner said, I don't know, just take them. Get a bill out. Is that what we've really come to? Is that what we've really come to? That the Cheryl Tiemans of the world cannot have some certainty on a forced sale? I am so disappointed in what I have witnessed today. This isn't a place where you just have amendments pop up. At 7 o'clock last night in that venerable room where deals have been cut, where Dean Whitmire talked about this place and how special the state Senate is, I said, what else can we do to get you to be for this bill? And the one thing, the meetings being tied to something so you can't do it a year or 2 years in advance, I offered it up. I said, I'll give up on that. Do the meetings whenever you want. And the answer was, no, we got another 40 things. Another 40 things. After all of this, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that the state of Texas has made it so easy for people to take other people's land. And that is not what this bill is about. You can still go down to the Railroad Commission and check a box and have eminent domain authority. Senator Buckingham, we should move your bill after what I've seen, what I've been through for 3 weeks. Gosh darn, I am a pro-business Republican. I believe in oil and gas. But I will tell you what Joan Huffman said when one of them said, severance tax goes to the rainy day fund. We're the ones that build the rainy day fund. She looked straight down that table right here and said, everyone who has ever given up their land has given to the rainy day fund. Touche. I wish I would have thought about that comeback. Thank you for your courage. So members, yeah, I'll look at the amendments. I'll do my very best. For 3 weeks, I've done my very best. You heard with great emotion my story of Doug Smith and what he meant to me after my dad was killed. He wrote me he gave me a plaque when he left Brenham, and he said, "To the most competitive player I've ever coached. You can be and you will be. You and God control your future." It's funny. You can tell I memorized it because that was the only thing that made me live at times. Today I almost quit. Nathan Johnson, you almost saw it. But I'm not going to quit. I am not going to quit for these landowners because they deserve better from us. They deserve better from us. So with that, Mr. President, I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business and take up and consider at this time committee substitute to Senate Bill 421.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Buckingham, Campbell, Creighton, Fallon, Flores, Hall, Hancock, Hinojosa, Huffman, Hughes, Johnson, Colcourse, Lucio, Menendez, Miles, Nelson, Nichols, Paxton, Perry, Powell, Rodriguez, Schwertner, Sulliger, Taylor, Watson, West, Whitmire, and Zaffarini.
Members, there being 26 ayes and 4 nays, the rules are suspended. Chair lays down the second reading committee substitute for Senate Bill 421. Chair will read the caption.
Committee substitute, Senate Bill 421, relating to the acquisition of real property by an entity with eminent domain authority.
The following amendment, Secretary will read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 1 by Colcourse.
You're recognized on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this amendment replaces the language of the substitute with a version of the bill that is more agreeable to both parties involved. As I said in my opening remarks, I cannot guarantee that every party will be completely happy with the language, and sometimes when both parties are upset, you probably have a pretty good bill, and that's probably where we are. Additional changes, as we move through this process, will probably happen in the House. But let me go through this floor amendment very quickly. Your staff should have had this yesterday, and a side-by-side was also provided. The floor amendment still contains the 3 major provisions I talked about. The initial offer based on a verifiable independent number, a requirement that certain terms be included in an easement or other instrument of conveyance, and finally, a meeting requirement designed to increase the transparency to the condemnation process. So Section 1, the most important part of that is Section 1 of the floor amendment applies the bill only to private condemners. We have made that very clear. It does not include any of the publics, and it removes the fiscal note. Additionally, the substitute removes the 145% requirement that many objected to. I mentioned in my opening remarks that the substitute requires the private entity to base the offer on one of 4 options. This was heavily negotiated. An appraisal, a comparative market analysis of the property based on 3 comparable sales, a broker price opinion based on 3 comparable sales, and a market study. All are required to be conducted by a licensed broker or appraiser. This language, and we worked very hard with TREC, the Texas Real Estate Commission, on making sure that this was a doable, workable piece of legislation. It still provides a firm, objective target to base the initial offer, so we don't see an initial offer of $10. Additionally, Section 1 requires the private entity to participate in a landowner meeting that is described in Section 3 of the bill, and that is obtain a written appraisal report before submitting the final offer. And then, members, Section 1 adds a new subsection E that requires damages to the remainder and other damages to be stated as a separate number in the initial offer. Section 2 on the floor substitute redesignates existing law allowing a court to abate and remand a process for failing to adhere to a bona fide offer requirement. This existing law would also allow a court to award cost and attorney fees. By moving this language to the existing bona fide offer section, it is more clear that the condemners must adhere to these requirements or risk abatements. Section 3 on the floor substitute contains easement terms that are largely similar to those found in the committee substitute. It did add subsection 21.0114A contains a list of terms that must be included in the deed, easement, and other agreements. Notable changes include allowing the private entity to use only the best available description and location of the easement that they have in their possession at the time of the terms or that the terms are provided, and allowing the private entity to provide payments to the landowner to reimburse them for failing to repair a gate or a fence or compensate them for damages to the land that has not been restored. The committee substitute forced them to restore the land themselves. So there was a lot of compromise on that. I would say that this section of the bill highly negotiated and largely agreed upon. A couple other things that I wanted to point out would be that Section 3 allows the parties to negotiate for any additional terms to amend the terms of the easement within the consent of the party. Members, as we go through Section 4, the amendment requires a petition filed in the court related to condemnation by a private entity to include the terms of the easement included in Section 3. Section 5 adds the amended meeting requirement. Unlike the committee substitute, which allowed for a large number of people, basically a public meeting, to be at the meeting, this part of the amendment creates a mechanism for property owner information meetings only. It also gives that instead of having the trigger for a meeting be 25 people, I gave to oil and gas to say 25 tracks, which was something that the landowners were able to give on. And as I said, 100-mile segment on the route. Members, a couple of other things. As I mentioned, the only people, it does say that you have to have the meeting after 5:30. The only people that can come in there are the landowner, a relative, an attorney, an appraiser, an employee, or leasee with direct knowledge of the property. The county judge actually can come into the meeting. None of us can. The private entity may require the landowner to identify additional attendees within 2 days. So if the landowner, had if they were elderly and wanted to bring somebody to help them, they have to tell the oil and gas company 2 days in advance to be able to let the people in. And so it again, pretty highly negotiated. And then the substitute ties the meeting to a certain time period. With that, I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. President.
Any question on the amendment? Hearing none.
I move adoption of the floor substitute, Mr. President.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Buckingham, Campbell, Creighton, Fallon, Flores, Hall, Hancock, Hinojosa, Huffman, Hughes, Johnson, Colcourse, Johnson, Lucio, Menendez, Miles, Nelson, Nichols, Paxton, Perry, Powell, Rodriguez, Schwertner, Sulliger, Taylor, West, Watson, West, Whitmer, and Zaffarine.
The amendment passes 31-0. Your floor amendment.
Thank you. Thank you, members, for realizing how far we've come on this bill with that vote, because certainly it is and I hate to say this out loud, it's a weaker bill from whence it was voted out of state affairs, but a compromised bill with oil and gas.
Members, the motion is passage to engrossment. Is there any objection? And I'm asking because there were no objections to the amendment, so if there are no objections to engrossment, bill passes to engrossment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I move.
Well, Senator, I don't know where you are on this vote because there were a few no votes on passage, but I think you have your 25. If not, you can have a second shot at it.
From a most grateful standpoint, Mr. President, I move to suspend the constitutional rule that bills be heard on 3 several days.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Buckingham, Campbell, Creighton, Fallon, Flores, Hall, Hancock, Hinojosa, Huffman, Hughes, Johnson, Colcourse, Lucio, Menendez, Miles, Nelson, Nichols, Paxton, Perry, Powell, Rodriguez, Schwertner, Sulliger, Taylor, Watson, West, Whitmer, and Zaffarine.
Senator, 28 aye votes, 3 no votes. Rules are suspended. Chair lays out on third reading final passage committee substitute for Senate Bill 421. Secretary, read the caption.
Committee substitute Senate Bill 421 relating the acquisition of real property by an entity with eminent domain authority.
You're recognized on final passage.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I move final passage, I also want to recognize Representative Dwayne Burns in the Texas House, who's worked on this bill last session and this session with me. It was wonderful to see a House member sit in the Ramsey room with us for hours and hours on Thursday nights and Fridays, not going home, working on the weekends with me on this bill. And thank you, Mr. President. The Lieutenant Governor never picked a side, but sat in the Ramsey room, never picked a side, and sat in the Ramsey room and said, we can do better for Texas. We can come together. And I appreciate the fairness by which you did that and your interest in this bill for the landowners and for oil and gas. With that, Mr. President, I move final passage of the committee substitute to Senate Bill 421.
And Senator, thank you. The members, you really don't realize how many hours. I know I was probably in there for 15 hours over 3 weeks, which I've never done on another bill. You were in there for 3 times that many, as was your staff and my staff. And I thank all sides for trying to come together, and hopefully at the end of the day we get a bill to the governor's desk. The vote is 28 ayes and 3 nays. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members, for your support today. Thank you as well.